Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Let me resume the point about the first-person perspective with which I had ended the last lecture. The point that there is a distinction that Lynn Baker draws between strong first-person perspective and weak first-person perspective. The distinction, and a distinction to which implicitly I think Qasim Qassam also subscribes, the distinction is this, according to Baker. The bird example that I'm citing and the human subject with which I'm contrasting the bird as examples or instances of two conscious individuals, both having the first-person perspective in virtue of being entities with consciousness. How do they differ according to Baker? According to Baker, the bird has the first-person perspective as a conscious subject, but the first-person perspective in the weak sense. And what is this weakness? The weakness is that while the world appears to the bird from the first-person perspective that the bird instantiates or occupies. In other words, much as the world of our experience, human experience, is presented to us from our first-person perspective, just as the world of human experience, or just as the experience of the world is presented to a human subject in this first-personal mode of presentation or first-personal mode of givenness, which I described as the self-givenness or self-presentational way. Similarly, to the bird also, whatever experience it has of the world is presented to it in that mode of self-givenness, in that self-presentational mode. In other words, from the bird's own point of view, one could say, on behalf of the bird, that the bird experience is presented to that bird with that for-me-ness quality. I mean, it is like on behalf of saying on behalf of the bird that the fish experience is presented to me the fish. The experience is mine. That means the fish's experience. To that extent, it satisfies the first-person perspective. Experiences are delivered in the first-person perspective. Experiences could not have been delivered in any other perspective, because consciousness is structurally first-personal. On the other hand, in spite of this first-personal givenness of the fish experience, the fish as an individual has no awareness of itself being itself, of its own identity as that particular fish. having certain experiences of the world. In other words, there's no conceptual level ability that the fish possesses. That ability whereby a conscious individual is able to think of oneself as oneself. The ability to think of oneself as oneself is a conceptual ability. And this ability to think of oneself as oneself is, of course, grounded in the possession of the first person perspective, but that grounding by itself is not sufficient to enable the individual to have this ability to think of itself as itself, or to think of oneself as oneself. The individual would require an additional ability, which is the conceptual ability. It may be a matter of ultimately cognitive difference, that the cognitive constitution of the bird doesn't allow that conceptual ability to think of itself as itself, to have a sense of its own identity as that particular fish having a series of experiences of the world. In the human case, that ability is very much possessed by human beings, but only by sufficiently mature human individuals. And that's why I had referred to the example of the excuse me, the very young baby, which is, of course, a human individual furnished with the first person perspective of consciousness, but it lacks that sort of cognitive sophistication or that sort of cognitive development whereby it would acquire at that point of time the conceptual ability to think of itself as itself, to have any sense of self-identity as something that it is explicitly aware of. That comes later in the human case when the baby grows, when there is sufficient cognitive development, so that, of course, just like the bird, in the case of the baby also, the world is presented to the baby from the baby's first person point of view. So the self-presentational, self-given quality of its experiences is very much true, because that's just a structural point about consciousness. So the consciousness of the baby and the consciousness of the bird, and also the consciousness of the mature human being, in all the three cases there is no difference of the self-presentational character of the respective experiences, self-presentational and self-manifesting character of the respective experiences. But that self of the self-presentational and self-manifesting character of experience, that self is not not a proper self. In fact, Lynn Baker would say that that doesn't quite amount to a self, because one has the self only when one has the first person perspective in a stronger sense, which is the first person perspective the first person perspective which is accompanied by a conceptual ability to think of oneself as oneself, to in fact the ability to think of what is known as I thoughts, I, the first person singular, the subject, I thoughts. I mean, in language, of course, there are so many I thoughts, like I went there and I am in possession of this, or it belongs to me. All these I thoughts presuppose a certain conceptual ability to think of oneself as oneself. That is not available either to the young baby or to the bird, even though they are instances of conscious individuals. So if there is a theory of the self in Baker's account and in Kassam's account, then the theory of the self, even if one were to call it the minimal self by going back to Zahavi's account, that self would not be available unless the conscious creature has the first person perspective in the strong sense. So there is the big difference whether the purely perspectival specification of the self is enough in order to theorize the reality of a self, the availability of a self. In the case of Zahavi, as we would recall from the last lecture, the minimal self, which is a thin self, its minimality or thinness is because of the way it is constituted. I did say quite a bit on that point, which is it is constituted only by the first person perspective. Its constitution, the constitution of the thin self or the minimal self, is not dependent on anything other than the fact that experiences are delivered through the first person perspective or in the modality of the first person perspective. So this fully perspectival specification of the self is a very minimalist way of defining the self. And as I said, this is the notion of an empty self. The minimal or thin self is an empty self. Empty because it has no content whatsoever, no mental content. And that is because if it is entirely perspectively constituted, then since a perspective is not a content, the perspectively constituted self would be a contentless, empty self. So that's the notion in Zahavi. And Zahavi considers it to be a self. That means the perspectival interpretation is both necessary and sufficient for defining what the self is in this thin and minimal sense. For Baker and Kassam, that's not the case, because that conceptual ability to think of oneself as oneself is something like an addition to the possession of the first-person perspective. In a way, the possession of the first-person perspective is quite primitive. Primitive because it's only a matter of having consciousness. If the entity is a conscious entity, a conscious individual, ipso facto, by that very fact, the entity has the first-person perspective. In that case, that's primitive. That's a primitive fact. But this primitive possession of the first-person perspective is not sufficient for amounting to a self, and that's the view of Baker and Kassam. Conceptual ability obviously is an addition. It's a sort of cognitive improvement, cognitive addition. You acquire a conceptual ability to think of yourself as yourself, to think of oneself as oneself, or to the ability to use the concept, the ability to use the first-person singular, the first-person singular pronoun, the I. Obviously, the bird lacks that ability. And obviously, the very young baby, human baby, also lacks that ability. And so, in this strong first-person perspective version, it would seem that somehow language would be a requirement. Language and a certain amount of rationality, rational power would be a requirement to acquire the conceptual ability, the ability to make use of the first-person singular pronoun. The possession of a self-concept is considered to be a necessary condition for being a self. And this stronger view is a fairly dominant view, especially in the Anglo-American analytic tradition. Now, I am going along Zahavi's phenomenological view, which is that you have a notion of a self which is minimal and thin precisely because the possession of the first-person perspective is both necessary and sufficient for it. And this notion of a minimal or thin self is the notion of pre-reflective self-consciousness or pre-reflective self-awareness that we had discussed in the last lecture, that every phenomenal experiential state is by nature such that in being aware of the what it is like property of the given state, you are aware of having that awareness. That's the idea of self-awareness or pre-reflective self-awareness. It is pre-reflective because that self-awareness is built into the very experience, or for that matter, is built into the very nature of phenomenal consciousness. Here, I could probably digress a little bit to say something more about the perspectival interpretation of the self, that thin or minimal self. although it's a bit of a digression, it is to some extent relevant in an important sense, or it is an important digression. There is another contemporary philosopher named Mirri Albahari, an Australian philosopher, and in very recent times, this idea of a minimal self that is proposed and championed by Zahavi, this idea has been to some extent contested by Albahari in terms of her own analysis and classification of self. In Albahari's account, the notion of the self is analyzed in terms of three features, corresponding to which three features there are, let's say, three kinds of selves, or at least not necessarily three kinds of selves, but three kinds of characterization of the subject of consciousness, subject of experience. And the terminology that she uses to articulate this difference, this sort of tripartite classification of the subject of experience is ownership. The notion of self somehow goes pretty well with the notion of ownership. If, for example, I say that I have a perceptual awareness of the setting sun, then this perceptual experience is claimed to be possessed by me. I am the owner of this perceptual experience. So there is a sense of ownership attached to the notion of the self. And ownership could be of three kinds. The very elementary kind would be possessive ownership. That is to say, I possess a car, for instance. But possessive ownership is so elementary that it hardly relates to the notion of ownership that's more appropriate to the idea of the self. So, having mentioned the example of personal ownership, she sort of sets it aside as not being very relevant to the issue under discussion. Then she goes on to talk about perspectival ownership. And perspectival ownership, that idea is very similar to the idea of the minimal self proposed by Zahavi. And that is precisely the reason I'm making this digression. Because when Albahari is talking about perspectival ownership in relation to the idea of the subject of experience, is she proposing the same idea of a minimal self or thin self which is being proposed by Zahavi? Because Zahavi also provides a purely perspectival account of the self. The answer to this question, very interesting question, is in the negative. That is to say, even though it is the first person perspective to which both Albahari and Zahavi make their essential reference in articulating the notion of a subject of experience, there is a significant divergence between the two, and the divergence is this. While for Albahari, the perspectival owner is a subject of experience precisely because and only because the subject occupies the first person perspective. You know, the occupation, the mere fact of the occupation or instantiation of the first person perspective, which is a purely structural fact of consciousness, because any consciousness has the first person perspective built into it as a structural property. In that case, the subject of consciousness for Albahari is a owner of whatever that conscious experiential state is, merely and precisely in virtue of that experience being possessed or owned by the subject. So the subject of experience is a perspectival owner of whatever that experience is, which is presented to it from the first person perspective. However, she says that this perspectival owner does not amount to a self proper. It's not a self, not even a minimal self, not even a thin self. And that is a difference with the idea of Zahavi, which we need to understand. Why is Albahari disclaiming that the perspectival owner is a subject of experience but not a self? So she is drawing a distinction, subtle distinction, between a subject of experience which would amount to a self proper and a subject of experience which would fall short of being a self proper. And what is that distinction? The distinction is this. For Albahari, if a subject of experience is really a self, then that subject of experience, that self, would be aware of itself being distinct from the not self, namely the other. In other words, being a self entails possessing the idea or ability to distinguish itself from the other, from the not self. So being a self accompanies the awareness of being other than the not self or the other. That self-other distinction, conceptual distinction, has to be part of being a self. And the perspectival owner in Albahari's account, the perspectival owner does not have the sense of being a self, as distinct from a not self or anybody else. Nonetheless, it is a subject of experience, because here the subjectivity of this subject of experience has no more content than the first person perspective. And about that emptiness or contentlessness of a subject of experience, which is constituted merely by the first person perspective, we have had enough discussion while talking about Zahavi's example. So the difference between Zahavi and Albahari is that that for Zahavi, the fact that something is given to me in the self-given mode of consciousness is sufficient to make me not just a subject of experience, but also a self proper, even though just a minimal or thin self. For Albahari, what happens is that, I mean, your state of consciousness could be so very pure, so very innocent, so very innocuous, that you own that experience, given experience, only because that experience is given in the first person perspective. You have absolutely no contribution from your own side. That's what makes your ownership of the given experience an entirely innocuous kind of ownership. And your ownership is an entirely gratuitous ownership. I mean, there is no commitment, no investment in that ownership. I'm using all these metaphors just to try to explicate the innocuousness of ownership. Now, maybe at this point I should refer to another tradition, a classical tradition in Indian philosophy, which will clarify this point. And indeed, my reference to that Indian tradition in classical philosophy would not be arbitrary, because the whole point of Albahari is to articulate a conception of subjectivity that is consistent with that classical tradition of Indian philosophy, and that tradition happens to be Buddhism. In other words, she is trying to provide a very modernized account of what Buddhist conception of consciousness and subjectivity might look like. And that is to say, in her case, what she is trying to do, she is trying to develop the notion of a pure subject of experience or innocuous subject of experience, where the subjectivity in question is merely a matter of the fact that an experience is occurring in me or given to me in the first personal mode. I am neither identifying myself with that experience nor having any sense of possessing that experience and saying it is my experience distinct from somebody else's experience. In other words, there is no question of identification with that given experience. That's the point of innocuousness. And why is it relevant to Buddhism? As we know that in Buddhism, in Buddhist theory of consciousness or mental life or experience, the analysis is that of consciousness as a fleeting series of momentary states. Momentariness is part of the ontology, very much central to the ontology of Buddhist theory. So, but then these momentary experiential episodes are presented to the subject. Okay. And of course, there is anatmavada in Buddhism. That means there is no self in the sense of a substantial self, enduring self. There is no self. But that there is no self, does that mean there is no subjectivity whatsoever? No subjectivity in any way attached to or connected with the series of consciousness, the momentary, fleeting series of momentary episodes of consciousness. It's here the point of interpretation becomes very crucial, and Albahari tries to provide her own interpretation by saying that no self doesn't mean no subjectivity whatsoever, because consciousness will be presented in the first person perspective. First person perspective being a structural property of consciousness. But if the presentation of consciousness, the experiential presentation of consciousness, that flow of fleeting, momentary states of consciousness, no commitment is made to it, no identification with it occurs, then it is as good as anybody's consciousness, or rather, I should say, that content or that experiential flow would not really be owned in the sense of personal ownership, in the sense of identifying with what you own. It would be almost like a series of experiential states which remain anonymous. Anonymous in the sense that they are not owned. It's like if somebody is distributing gifts, and there is a person who has absolutely no desire whatsoever to accept anything as a gift, or for that matter, to possess anything. But then, since that person is sitting in a particular posture, that posture creates some kind of an accepting space, somebody comes and drops the object in that person's lap, as it were. And now, since there is no sense of identification with the given item, no desire to own it, then it remains there only in a gratuitous sense. That person happens to be the owner of the object, but there is no sense of personally owning it, and the object remains as anonymous, unowned by anyone. So that's the point Albahari wants to make. That's the sort of interpretation of subject of experience or subjectivity that she provides in order to provide a very contemporary, very new interpretation of Buddhist theory. So, since it is so very innocuous, there is no sense of identification, no sense of self-other distinction. Albahari's point is that a purely first-personal, perspectival conception of the subject of experience never amounts to a self. So that is the big difference between Zahavi and Albahari. For Zahavi, the self-other distinction is not a necessary condition for being a self. I mean, if you are a subject of consciousness merely because the states of consciousness are delivered in the first personal mode, then that is sufficient for you to become a minimal self. In that sense, Zahavi is referring to two thinkers. One is the psychologist Gibson, and the reference to Gibson is this. I mean, Gibson, as he's famous for, Gibson has this ecological approach to perceptual understanding. And according to Gibson, the very flow pattern of optical information, as it happens in perception, visual perception, the very flow pattern of optical information provides us with an awareness of our own movement and posture. That means if I'm noticing something in front of me, what's called the optical information would be whatever is visible to me happening, or whether it is static or moving, especially in the case of something moving, then in that very perceptual experience of the object, I am also aware of the subject that I am. That is to say, I'm aware of my own movement and posture relative to the perceptual scenario or object that I am encountering. That means the self-awareness is built into the perceptual experience, and that means the sense of self is automatically given. That's the reference to Gibson. Then the other reference is even more relevant to our discussion. And this is a reference to a philosopher called Jose Bermudez, American philosopher. And Bermudez is drawing something from the psychological literature in trying to account for self-consciousness. A philosophical treatise on self-consciousness, but argumentative points are grounded in empirically supportable resources drawn from psychology. So what Bermudez says is this, that suppose you think of a very young child. Now, does the very young child have a first-person perspective? Of course, our earlier discussion had said that yes, to be a conscious individual is ipso facto to be in possession of the first-person perspective. So both the young baby and the bird have the first-person perspective in virtue of their conscious constitution. Now, one might be skeptical about such purely conceptual remarks, okay, a priori conceptual claims. One might be skeptical because the possession or non-possession of the first-person perspective might be considered to be a matter of some sort of empirical substantiation, even if it is not definitive or decisive, but some sort of grounding in empirical psychological facts. Now, I do not have the precise source from which Bermudez as a philosopher draws in order to provide some sort of empirical support to this otherwise conceptual a priori claim about the structural feature of consciousness, namely its first-personal perspectival dimension or aspect. However, Bermudez is referring to the point of, let's say, a young child's entry into the first person perspective. Supposing one were in an empirically minded, psychologically oriented way, one were looking for some sort of evidence of the possession of the first person perspective in a very, very young child, an infant. How would such an empirical exploration go about? I mean, what sort of behavioral evidence on the part of the infant would count as, or would be an indicator of the possession of the first person perspective? Bermudez is reporting that entry into the first person perspective consists, and this is the empirical point, consists in the pickup of self-informing information. Pickup of self-informing information that starts at the beginning of life. So here the crucial point is, what kind of information is self-informing? That means when you pick up a particular kind of information, that also manifests that information is self-related. That's what makes it self-informing. Now, there is no particular example that I have found being cited by Bermudez of self-informing information. However, I think we could guess. For example, if an infant feels that a ball is in his or her hand, I mean, even if there is no linguistic ability, no conceptual ability, there would be at least that sense, that infantile sense of the presence of the ball in himself or herself. Okay? So the information about that ball in his or her vicinity would be an example of a self-informing information. Or if, for that matter, in a more negative way, if the mother of the infant is moving away from the infant after feeding the infant breast milk, then the infant might get the sense of the loving mother's moving away. Okay? It is also self-informing in the negative sense, that the information that she is moving away from me. Okay? And there could be multiplication of such self-informing instances of information. Such examples or empirical evidence are drawn upon in trying to substantiate the otherwise conceptual a priori point that the first person perspective enters into the very life of consciousness right at the stage of infancy. So this is not really equivalent to the a priori conceptual claim that the first person perspective is a built-in structural feature of consciousness. Nonetheless, it is worth trying to provide an empirical substantiation of a purely conceptual a priori point, and this seems to be well in that direction. In other words, Bermudez wants to claim that infants are born into the first person perspective. Infants are born into the first person perspective, and this first person perspective is not something that they have to acquire ab initio, that they have to acquire from nothing. Okay? So the whole point is that, I mean, this would connect with Albahari's point. Suppose in place of that innocuous person who has no desire to accept anything, but something is given to that person in and since it falls in his or her lap, it is as though it has fallen there, it is held by this person only because it happened to fall in his lap. No commitment, no identification. Okay? That's the perfect example of innocuousness. Now, if we take the case of the infant, it would be a fairly good example of what it is to be an innocuous subject of experience. Because infancy, very early infancy, obviously would be a good example of innocuousness. Now, since the first person perspective is already there in that in that infant, so the experiences had by this infant would be had in an innocuous way. That means the experiences that would occur in the first person mode to this infant would as it were be experiences which are anonymous. One might say the baby, that infant, owns the experiences had by it, but that ownership, which is a merely perspectival ownership, is a gratuitous kind of ownership, precisely because of that innocuousness. The baby has no sense of ever thinking, oh, this is my experience. Okay? My experience in the sense of identifying with that experience and personally possessing that experience as its own experience, distinguished from others' experiences. Okay? So the lack of this personalization of the ownership is what amounts to innocuousness. Now, these points, the gratuitousness of the ownership, the innocuousness of the ownership, these points are not under consideration in Zahavi's account, because for Zahavi, being a self is directly and absolutely a matter of receiving the informational content or experiential content in the first person perspective. So the difference is that a purely perspectival analysis of self or the subject of consciousness could divide, could diversify into two conceptions. In one conception, the subject of consciousness remains merely a subject, doesn't become a self because of the lack of personalization. In the other case, it automatically becomes a self, a minimal or thin self, merely in virtue of its being presented in the first personal perspective. So, for Albahari, there is the third kind of ownership, and I have already mentioned willy-nilly. I have mentioned and probably already indicated that that is personal ownership. So the first one was possessive ownership, which was bracketed out as not being very relevant. The second one was perspectival ownership, and now it is personal ownership. The difference between perspectival ownership and personal ownership is the difference between being an innocuous subject of experience and being a subject of experience which is partial to or committed to the experience that is given. So in the third case, the given experience has been personalized. And what is personalization of an experience? An experience is personalized when the subject identifies with that experience, when the subject begins to think that it is his or her experience, it is his or her, if you like, exclusive possession. And this personalization of experience implies that the subject has a sense of being a self as opposed to the other, that self-other distinction is prominent. So Albahari is saying that you have the notion of a self not merely because the experiences that you have are given to you in the first personal perspectival mode, which of course is given, but in addition to that, what is delivered through the first person perspective has also to be identified as the self's, as the subject's own. So the mechanism of identification has to be operative. Only then there is personalization through the mechanism of identification, and then there is a proper self. In this respect, as I am now going to conclude this lecture, in this respect, this third notion of ownership in terms of personal ownership, which amounts to self, full-blooded self, which distinguishes itself or which has a sense of being not being the other, is rather similar to the strong first-person perspective that Baker and Qasim Qassam are advocating. I mean, the only point is that while Baker talks about the first-person perspective being strong, having that conceptual ability to think of oneself as oneself, Albahari is not going into in that conceptual direction, but merely talking about the psychological mechanism of identification. So that is a significant difference, but at the same time, they can be brought into a homogeneous view if adequate differences are isolated. So with this, I close this particular lecture. Thank you.